There are names that history tries to bury, names that governments erase from textbooks, names that empires hope you will forget, but some names refuse to die. In the year 1960, one man stood up before the most powerful nations on earth and declared with a voice that shook kings and presidents and generals that Africa belonged to Africans. He was 34 years old. He had been free for less than 6 months, and within a year he would be dead. His name was Patrice Lumumba, and this is his story. In this documentary, we are going to tell you the full story of one of Africa's most important and most dangerous men. Dangerous not because he carried weapons, but because he carried ideas. We will take you back to the Belgian Congo, a land of extraordinary natural wealth held under one of the most brutal colonial regimes in human history. We will introduce you to a self-educated man from a small village who became the voice of 10 million people. We will follow him through the birth of a nation, through triumph, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy. We will examine carefully and honestly the forces that worked against him: Belgian colonial interests, Cold War politics, American intelligence agencies, and the fragile alliances inside the Congo itself. And we will ask the question that history has never stopped asking. Was Patrice Lumumba a visionary who came too soon, or was he simply too dangerous to let live? This is not just the story of one man. This is the story of Africa's struggle for its soul. This is the story of what happens when a continent tries to claim its own destiny and the world decides it is not ready. Stay with us, because this story matters now more than ever. To understand Patrice Lumumba, you must first understand the land he came from. The Congo Basin is one of the most extraordinary places on earth. It sits at the geographical heart of Africa, a vast territory of more than 2.3 million square kilometers, larger than Western Europe. Its forests are ancient. Its rivers are the second largest river system on the planet. Its soil holds copper, gold, diamonds, cobalt, coltan, minerals that would one day power the modern world. For thousands of years before European contact, the peoples of this region built kingdoms, civilizations, and trade networks. The Kingdom of Congo, not to be confused with the colonial state, was a sophisticated, centralized monarchy that existed long before European colonizers arrived. It had its own legal systems, diplomatic traditions, currency, and spiritual practices. The Mongo, the Congo, the Luba, the Lunda, these were not primitive peoples. They were complex societies with their own histories, philosophies, and achievements. They had survived for centuries on their own terms. Then, in the late 19th century, the world changed for them forever. In 1884 and 1885, the major powers of Europe gathered in Berlin for a conference. They were not discussing military strategy or trade agreements. They were discussing Africa. Specifically, they were discussing how to divide Africa among themselves. The Berlin Conference, also called the Congo Conference, produced what is known as the General Act of Berlin, with the stroke of pens and the drawing of arbitrary lines on maps. European powers claimed ownership of a continent they had not built, lands they did not live in, and peoples they had not asked. The Congo, that vast mineral-rich heartland, was handed not to a nation but to a single man, King Leopold II of Belgium. What followed was one of the most devastating human rights catastrophes in recorded history. King Leopold's Congo Free State which existed from 1885 to 1908, was not a colony in any traditional sense. It was a personal possession, a plantation, a machine for extracting rubber and ivory through systematic terror. The Force Publique, Leopold's armed enforcers, imposed rubber quotas on Congolese villages. Those who failed to meet quotas were mutilated. Hands were cut off, villages were burned, families were taken hostage. Soldiers were ordered to bring back severed hands as proof of punishment. Historians estimate that under Leopold's rule, the population of the Congo fell by somewhere between 5 and 10 million people through direct killing, famine, disease, and the collapse of communities. International outcry, led by reformers like Edmund Dean Morel and Irish journalist Roger Kesman, eventually forced Leopold to surrender his personal possession. In 1908, the Congo became a former colony of the Belgian state, renamed the Belgian Congo. This was improvement in name only. Belgian colonial rule maintained racial segregation, forced labor, and systematic humiliation. Africans were classified as legal minors. They could not vote, could not move freely without passes, could not enter most buildings, could not hold professional positions, could not even sit in the same public spaces as white Belgians. Belgium's approach to colonial rule was particular in its design. Unlike the British Empire, which occasionally trained small numbers of Africans for limited administrative roles, Belgium made a deliberate policy choice: keep Congolese people uneducated and dependent. Education in the Belgian Congo was almost entirely controlled by the Catholic Church. Primary schooling was permitted, basic literacy, religious instruction, vocational training. But higher education was almost completely forbidden. By 1960, the year of independence, the Belgian Congo had produced, by most accounts, fewer than 30 university graduates from among a population of 15 million people. There were no Congolese doctors, no Congolese lawyers, no Congolese engineers trained at the highest levels, no Congolese military officers above the rank of sergeant. The colonial administration deliberately ensured that when independence came, Africans would be, in the colonial phrase, not yet ready to govern themselves. This was not accident. This was architecture, a system designed not merely to extract wealth, but to keep a people from ever believing they were capable of more. It was into this world, this carefully constructed world of subjugation, that Patrice Lumumba was born. To understand what happened to Lumumba, you must also understand the world he entered. By the late 1950s, the world was divided. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two great superpowers that emerged after World War II, were locked in what historians call the Cold War, a global ideological struggle between Western capitalism and Soviet communism. Neither power was willing to fight each other directly. Instead, they fought through proxy, funding, arming, and supporting movements and governments across the developing world. Africa, with its vast natural resources and dozens of newly independent nations, became a critical battleground. Any African leader who spoke of nationalizing resources, building Pan-African alliances, or refusing to align with the West was immediately labeled, in the language of the time, a communist threat. The Congo was not just any country. It contained some of the most strategically important minerals on earth. Its uranium from the Shinkolobwe mine had literally been used in the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945. Its copper, cobalt, and industrial diamonds were critical to Western manufacturing. For the United States, keeping the Congo aligned with the West was not just desirable. It was, in the words used at the time, a matter of national security. This context matters enormously because into this world, this geopolitical powder keg would step one young man from Onalua village, armed with nothing but his words and his conviction. Across Africa, a wind was blowing. Ghana was free. Guinea was free. The year 1960 would come to be known as the Year of Africa, when 17 African nations declared independence in a single 12-month period. The question was not whether the Congo would be free. The question was on whose terms. Patrice Emery Lumumba was born on July 2nd, 1925 in the village of Onalua in the Kasai province of the Belgian Congo, in what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo. He came from the Tetela people, a community known for their warrior tradition and fierce sense of independence. His father, Francois Tolenga Otechima, was a farmer. His family was poor, rooted in the land, living under colonial rule as most Congolese families did, without political rights, without legal equality, without the right to call themselves citizens of their own country. Lumumba was educated at Catholic and Protestant mission schools, the limited education that colonial authorities permitted. He was, by all accounts, extraordinary, a student of voracious curiosity. He read everything he could find. He wrote poetry. He taught himself the French language at an advanced level and would one day use it to electrify an entire nation. As a young man, Lumumba moved to Stanleyville, the city known today as Kisangani, where he worked first as a postal clerk, then as a beer salesman for the Bracongo brewery. These were among the very few professional positions available to educated Congolese men under Belgian rule. But even in these constrained positions, Lumumba's restless mind and remarkable talent were evident. He wrote articles for Congolese newspapers and magazines. He joined African cultural associations, the only semi-political spaces available to Congolese at the time. He became known as a speaker of unusual power, a man who could take a room and hold it, who could turn ordinary words into something that felt like fire. He was also, by all accounts, intensely human, capable of great warmth and great anger, driven by ambition, flawed, complex, and deeply sincere in his beliefs. To understand why Patrice Lumumba was considered so dangerous, you must understand what he believed. First, Lumumba believed in Congolese national unity above all else. The Belgian Congo contained hundreds of ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages with deep historical differences. Belgian colonial policy had deliberately encouraged these divisions, a classic strategy of divide and rule. Lumumba rejected this completely. He insisted that all Congolese, regardless of ethnicity, region, or religion, were one people with one shared destiny. Second, Lumumba believed that African independence had to be real independence, not nominal freedom with continued European economic control. He believed the Congo's vast natural resources, its minerals, its land, its rivers, belonged to the Congolese people, not to Belgian companies, not to American corporations, not to international investors, to the people. Third, Lumumba believed in Pan-Africanism, the idea that African nations were stronger together than apart. He saw the Congo not merely as a nation-state, but as the potential engine of a unified, sovereign, powerful Africa. He admired Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, who shared this vision. He believed that African nations had to cooperate economically and politically to resist continued domination. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly to Western powers, Lumumba believed in non-alignment. He did not want to join the Western Bloc or the Soviet bloc. He wanted the Congo to be free to trade with whomever offered the best terms, free to develop its own model of governance. free to chart its own course without being a pawn in anyone's Cold War. These were not radical ideas in the abstract. They were the ideas of sovereignty, the ideas of dignity. But in 1960, in the context of the Cold War, they were considered deeply, dangerously threatening. Lumumba did not stand alone. Around him gathered a generation of Congolese men and women who had dared to imagine a different future. Joseph Kasavubu was the leader of Abako, the Alliance of Bakongo People, a movement rooted in the Congo ethnic group. Kasavubu was more cautious than Lumumba, more focused on regional interests, and ultimately more willing to compromise with Belgian and Western interests. He and Lumumba were never truly aligned in their vision, a tension that would prove catastrophic. Antoine Gizenga was one of Lumumba's most loyal lieutenants, a committed nationalist who would later establish a government in Stanleyville in Lumumba's name after his death. Gizenga was more explicitly left-leaning than Lumumba, and his presence in the movement gave Western powers ammunition to paint the entire nationalist project as communist. Cyril Adula, Anicet Kashamura, and others represented the broader coalition of educated Congolese who had organized under the banner of Lumumba's political party, the MNC, or Mouvement National Congolais. Against Lumumba stood a remarkable and varied coalition of opponents, each with their own reasons for wanting him removed. The Belgian government and the Belgian establishment, the industrialists, the mining companies, the colonial administrators saw Lumumba as an existential threat to their continued economic dominance of the Congo. Belgium had extracted extraordinary wealth from the Congo for generations. That wealth flow could not continue if Lumumba's vision of resource sovereignty was realized. Moise Tshombe was the leader of Katanga province, the richest province in the Congo, containing most of its copper and cobalt deposits. Tshombe was backed by Belgian mining interests, particularly the massive Union Miniere du Haut-Katanga Corporation. He was willing to declare Katanga independent if that's what it took to keep the mines under foreign control. Joseph Désiré Mobutu, the young colonel who would later rename himself Mobutu Sese Seko and rule the Congo as a personal fiefdom for over 30 years, was at this time the head of the Army's General Staff. He was ambitious, calculating, and had cultivated close relationships with Western intelligence contacts. His role in Lumumba's fate was central and direct. The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, was monitoring the situation in the Congo with intense concern. The historical record, including declassified documents and later congressional testimony, shows that the senior CIA officials, including Director Allen Dulles, considered Lumumba a threat of the highest order and discussed options for his removal. These were the forces arrayed against one man. And then there were the people. 15 million Congolese men, women, and children, farmers and fishermen, miners and merchants, teachers and students, people who had lived under colonial rule for their entire lives and the lives of their parents and their grandparents. These were the people Lumumba spoke for. These were the people who wept at his speeches and cheered his name in the streets. These were the people who had the most to gain from independence and the most to lose if it was betrayed. Their story, their hopes and their suffering is at the heart of everything that follows. The story of Patrice Lumumba begins, as so great stories begin, with a child and a world that tried to limit him. Growing up in the Belgian Congo meant growing up in a state of enforced inferiority, every institution, every law, every custom of colonial society was designed to remind Africans that they were lesser in the eyes of the law, lesser in the eyes of the church, lesser in the eyes of the civilization that claimed ownership of their land. Lumumba absorbed these lessons, not in submission, but in fury. He watched, he read, he wrote. In poetry composed as a young man, he expressed what he could not yet say openly in politics, a deep burning sense that the world as it was wrong. He received his primary education at a Protestant mission school in Wembo-Neama, then later at a Catholic post school. He was among the tiny fraction of Congolese who received any formal schooling at all. He was extraordinarily gifted, and the constraints placed upon his ambitions by the colonial system made him aware, viscerally, personally, of exactly what colonialism cost. In the late 1940s and the early 1950s, Lumumba worked as a postal clerk in Stanleyville, the third largest city in the Belgian Congo. Here his world expanded dramatically. He became active in cultural and social organizations, the Evolués, as they were called. Evolué was the Belgian colonial term for educated Africans who had adopted European culture and customs. It was a condescending classification, but within these associations, in this limited space, the seeds of political consciousness were being planted. Lumumba joined the Amicale des Postiers, the Postal Workers Association. He wrote columns for Congolese newspapers and magazines, including La Voix du Congolais. He was becoming known. He was becoming a voice. In 1954 and 1955, he traveled to Belgium, one of only a small number of Congolese ever permitted to do so, where he encountered the full reality of European society and returned with his convictions about colonial injustice only deepened and sharpened. The mid-1950s saw the wind of change beginning to blow with undeniable force across the African continent. In 1957, Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to independence, the first sub-Saharan African country to achieve it. His speech at the independence ceremony, "Ghana, your beloved country is free forever," sent electric shocks through every African still living under colonial rule. For Lumumba, it was a revelation. It was not merely possible. It was happening. Africa was waking up. In 1958, Lumumba founded the Mouvement National Congolais, the MNC. This was a crucial distinction. Unlike most other Congolese political movements of the time, which were organized along ethnic or regional lines, the MNC was explicitly national. It sought to represent all Congolese people from all regions of all backgrounds. It was perhaps Lumumba's most important political contribution, and also, paradoxically, his most dangerous one. A movement that truly crossed ethnic lines was a movement that could not be controlled by dividing communities against each other. In December 1958, Lumumba traveled to Accra, Ghana, for the All African People's Conference. This gathering of African nationalist leaders, convened by Nkrumah, changed Lumumba profoundly. He met freedom fighters from across the continent. He heard languages he had never heard before, but understood their message completely. He returned to the Congo electrified with a continental vision and an unshakable conviction that independence was not just desirable, it was imminent, it was necessary, and it was now. In January 1959, speaking to a mass crowd in Leopoldville, the capital city known today as Kinshasa, Lumumba delivered what became one of the most consequential speeches in Congolese history. Riots broke out in the city. The Belgian authorities, shaken, began to realize that the ground was shifting under their feet. By 1959, Belgium realized it could no longer hold the Congo by force. The cost, both financial and political, was becoming too great. The colonial administration decided to move toward independence, but on Belgian terms, terms designed to maintain economic control, even as formal political power was transferred. In January 1960, the Round Table Conference was convened in Brussels. Congolese political leaders, including Lumumba, who attended despite having recently been imprisoned by colonial authorities on charges of inciting riots, negotiated with Belgian officials the terms of independence. Lumumba's imprisonment, far from silencing him, had elevated his status enormously. He arrived at the conference as the most recognizable Congolese political figure, and he dominated the negotiations with his intelligence and his forceful clarity of vision. The outcome of the Round Table Conference was a date. Independence Day, June 30th, 1960. Elections were scheduled for May 1960. The MNC won more seats in the National Parliament than any other single party, though not an outright majority. Through difficult political negotiations, Lumumba was designated as Prime Minister, with Joseph Kasavubu, a more conservative figure, more acceptable to Belgian and Western interests, as President. It was a compromise government, a fragile one. But on the morning of June 30th, 1960, none of that mattered. What mattered was this: the Belgian Congo was free. Independence Day, June 30th, 1960. Leopoldville, King Baudouin of Belgium, had arrived for the ceremony and delivered a speech praising Belgian colonialism, describing Leopold II as a great civilizing figure. The speech was, to most Congolese ears, an outrage. Belgian officials and Western diplomats had prepared a careful diplomatic response from the Congolese side, a polite, grateful address that would ease the transition. Lumumba had other ideas. What he delivered that day was not the approved speech, it was a declaration, his voice rising and falling with extraordinary control. Lumumba spoke truths that had never been spoken on that stage before. He spoke of the suffering of the Congolese people under colonial rule. He spoke of the indignities, the beatings, the forced labor, the contempt. He spoke of the strength it had taken to survive and the strength it would take to build a nation. He declared that independence was not a gift from Belgium. It was the product of African struggle, African sacrifice, African determination. He looked directly at the Belgian king. He told the truth. It was one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of African politics. Belgian officials were furious. Western governments were alarmed. But for millions of Africans in the Congo and across the continent, that speech was a declaration of something deeper than independence. It was a declaration of dignity. Belgium's reaction was immediate and lasting. The speech, unauthorized, unfiltered, defiant, confirmed for Belgian officials and Western allies that Lumumba was not a man they could manage, not a man they could work with. What happened next would unfold over the following 6 months with the speed and horror of a tragedy that seemed, in retrospect, almost inevitable. The newly independent Congo did not get even 2 weeks of peace. On July 5th, 1960, just 5 days after independence, Congolese soldiers of the Force Publique mutinied. They mutinied for a specific reason. The Belgian officers who had commanded them under colonialism were still in their positions. Nothing had changed in the army. White officers continued to give orders. Black soldiers continued to take them. The soldiers had expected independence to mean something. The mutiny was quickly followed by violence against Belgian civilians, which in turn prompted Belgium to send military forces back into the Congo without the permission of the Congolese government. This was a direct violation of Congolese sovereignty less than 2 weeks old. Then came the blow that would define the crisis. On July 11, 1960, Moise Tshombe, backed by Belgian mining interests and armed by Belgian military, declared the secession of Katanga province. The richest province in the Congo declared itself an independent nation. For Lumumba, this was catastrophe. The most mineral-rich part of his country, the economic heart that would have funded the independent Congolese state, had been carved off before the ink on independence documents was even dry. He appealed to the United Nations for help. The UN Security Council authorized a peacekeeping mission, ONUC's Operation des Nations Unies au Congo. But as Lumumba would discover to his growing horror, the UN mission was not there to help his government enforce its authority. It was there to maintain order, an order that increasingly seemed more aligned with Western interests than Congolese sovereignty. Facing the collapse of his country, unable to get Western help in ending the Katanga secession, and watching Belgian troops reoccupy Congolese soil, Lumumba made a decision that would seal his fate. He turned to the Soviet Union. In July 1960, Lumumba requested Soviet military assistance, specifically trucks, aircraft, and technical support, to help transport Congolese troops to Katanga to end the secession. Now it is essential to understand what this was and what it was not. Lumumba was not a communist. He never joined the Communist Party. He never expressed commitment to Soviet ideology. He was seeking military assistance from whomever would provide it, because the West would not. He had previously appealed to the United States and been rebuffed. But in the binary logic of the Cold War, context did not matter. The optics mattered. An African leader had accepted Soviet military assistance. That was enough. Western reactions were swift and extreme. President Dwight D. Eisenhower expressed serious concern about Lumumba. CIA Director Allen Dulles sent cables to the Congo station describing Lumumba as a threat of the highest order. Declassified documents later showed that Eisenhower raised the question of whether Lumumba should be eliminated, though historians continue to debate precisely what was authorized and what was carried out. What is documented beyond dispute is this. By August 1960, the highest levels of the United States government had concluded that Patrice Lumumba represented a threat that needed to be neutralized by one means or another. The political situation deteriorated rapidly through August 1960. President Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba were in open conflict. Their government, always a fragile coalition, was collapsing. On September 5th, 1960, President Kasavubu made a dramatic move. He declared on national radio that he was dismissing Lumumba as Prime Minister. Lumumba equally dramatically went on radio himself and declared that he was dismissing Kasavubu, the constitutional crisis, who had the legal authority to dismiss whom was never fully resolved. But it didn't matter, because within days, someone else stepped into the vacuum. On September 14th, 1960, Colonel Joseph Désiré Mobutu announced on radio that the army was neutralizing both the president and the prime minister and taking control. It was a coup. And while the army claimed to be merely ending the political deadlock, the direction of who benefited was unmistakable. Lumumba was stripped of effective power. His government buildings were surrounded. His communications were cut. He was isolated. And yet, even in this moment, Lumumba refused to be silent. He continued to speak. He continued to organize. His supporters in the streets did not abandon him. In Stanleyville, his political stronghold, His allies maintained control. He was not finished, which is exactly why his enemies moved to finish him. In late November 1960, Patrice Lumumba made a desperate decision. Under UN protection, which had effectively become house arrest, he could no longer act politically. He decided to escape to Stanleyville, where his vice premier Antoine Gizenga was organizing resistance and where he still had loyal popular support. On November 27th, he slipped away from his residence in Leopoldville under cover of darkness, along with his wife Pauline, his infant son Roland, and a small group of supporters. What followed was one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in modern African history. Lumumba's convoy moved through the countryside, stopping at villages along the way where people came out to hear him speak. He could not help it. Even as a fugitive, he was a leader. He stopped to address the people. Those stops cost him precious time. On December 1st, 1960, near Port Francqui, now Ilebo, Lumumba and his group were captured by Congolese soldiers loyal to Mobutu. The arrests were brutal. Lumumba was beaten, his wife and infant were with him. Photographs and footage taken at the scene, which circulated around the world, showed Lumumba with his hands tied behind his back, his glasses broken, his shirt torn, being pushed and struck by soldiers. He maintained his composure with extraordinary dignity, but the images were unmistakable. The first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo was a prisoner. What happened to Patrice Lumumba in the 6 weeks between his capture and his death has been the subject of extensive historical investigation, including a Belgian parliamentary inquiry in 2001, and remains one of the most documented political assassinations of the 20th century. The broad outline of events is established beyond reasonable historical dispute. Following his capture on December 1st, Lumumba was held at various detention facilities under conditions of increasing brutality. He was beaten, he was starved. Reports from witnesses describe systematic physical abuse. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba was transferred by aircraft to Elizabethville, the capital of the secessionist Katanga province, the territory controlled by his enemy Moise Tshombe. He was transferred with 2 of his associates, Maurice Mapolo and Joseph Okito. The transfer to Katanga was a death sentence. Everyone involved knew it. On the evening of January 17, 1961, Patrice Lumumba, Maurice Mpolo, and Joseph Okito were executed. They were killed by a firing squad in the presence of Katangese and Belgian officials. He was 35 years old. In the days that followed, his body and those of his companions was buried in a shallow grave. Then, in a final act of extraordinary brutality, Katangese and Belgian officials dug up the bodies and had them dissolved in sulfuric acid. The stated intent was to ensure that no grave existed that could become a shrine. They could destroy his body. They could not destroy what he represented. The news of Lumumba's death, when it was eventually announced in mid-February 1961, after weeks of official denial, sent shockwaves around the world, in Cairo, in Accra, in Moscow, in New York, in Paris. People took to the streets. The United Nations headquarters in New York was stormed by protesters. African nations recalled their ambassadors from Belgium. The world understood what had happened even without knowing all the details. A man had been killed for the crime of wanting his country to be truly free. The story of Patrice Lumumba contains layers that official histories, particularly those written in the West, often compress minimize, or omit entirely. Let us examine what we know and what is still debated. The involvement of the United States CIA in the events surrounding Lumumba's death is one of the most extensively documented controversies in Cold War history. In 1975, the Church Committee, a United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence chaired by Senator Frank Church, published findings that included testimony about CIA Director Allen Dulles approving an operation to eliminate Lumumba. CIA operative Richard Bissell testified that an assassination plan existed. CIA Station Chief Lawrence Devlin in Leopoldville received cables discussing Lumumba's elimination. What is historically contested is the precise nature of what was authorized and what was carried out. Devlin himself later claimed he had declined to implement direct assassination orders. Some historians argue the CIA was directly implicated in Lumumba's capture and transfer to Katanga. Others argue the CIA played a supporting role in destabilizing Lumumba's government through funding opposition figures and providing intelligence, rather than directly ordering his execution. What is not historically contested is this: the United States government at the highest levels considered Lumumba's removal a foreign policy priority. Whether this took the form of direct assassination planning or the sustained political and financial support of the forces that ultimately killed him, the moral weight is the same. In 2002, following a parliamentary commission of inquiry established in 2001, the Belgian government formally acknowledged moral and political responsibility for Lumumba's death. Belgian Foreign Minister Louis Michel stated that Belgium bore moral responsibility for the events that led to Lumumba's assassination and expressed his country's profound and sincere regret. This was significant, if belated. Belgium was not claiming direct operational responsibility, but acknowledging that Belgian officers and officials were present at Lumumba's execution, and that Belgium's political support for the Katanga secession and for the forces that captured and killed him constituted moral complicity. In 2022, over 60 years after his death, Belgian King Philippe returned to Lumumba's family a tooth that had been taken from his dissolving body as a trophy. It was the only physical remain of Patrice Lumumba that still existed. One of the most persistent and consequential misrepresentations in Western characterizations of Lumumba is the label communist. Scholars who have examined Lumumba's actual writings, speeches, and political record in detail are largely in agreement. Lumumba was a nationalist, not a communist. He was deeply influenced by Pan-African thought, by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and by the idea of Bandung non-alignment. He sought Soviet military assistance in July 1960 because the West refused to help him end the Katanga secession. This was a pragmatism in desperate circumstances, not ideological alignment. He had simultaneously sought help from the United States and the United Nations, both of which declined or proved unhelpful. The communist label was not an honest assessment. It was a political tool deployed by those who wanted to frame his nationalism as a threat in order to justify his removal. There is another dimension of Lumumba's story that is sometimes lost in the focus on Cold War geopolitics: the role of African agents, both for and against him. Mobutu, Chombe, and Kasavubu were Congolese men making choices. Their complicity in Lumumba's death was not merely the result of Western manipulation. They had their own ambitions, their own fears, their own calculations. Understanding this fully does not diminish the responsibility of external powers. It simply acknowledges the complexity of the history. At the same time, the thousands of ordinary Congolese who loved and supported Lumumba, who marched for him, sheltered him, wept for him, were also exercising African agency. The story of Lumumba is not only a story of what was done to an African leader. It is a story of what an African people dreamed and what they suffered when that dream was crushed. In June 2022, a ceremony was held in Brussels and later in Kinshasa. Belgian authorities returned to the Lumumba family the sole physical relic of Patrice Lumumba, a single gold-capped tooth. Belgian police officer Gerard Soete had taken the tooth from Lumumba's dissolving remains in 1961, a grotesque act of trophy-taking. After decades in private hands, it was recovered by Belgian authorities and returned. The ceremony was both deeply meaningful and deeply inadequate. A tooth. That is what remained of a man who tried to build a nation. But what also remained was far more than a tooth. What remained were his words, his vision, his name, and the question that his story forces every generation to ask again. The death of Patrice Lumumba did not simply end one man's life. It ended a political possibility, a trajectory for the Congo and for Africa. What followed Lumumba's death was Joseph Mobutu's consolidation of power. In 1965, Mobutu launched a formal military coup and seized total control of the country. He would rule for 32 years, renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko, renamed the country Zaire, and presided over one of the most spectacular examples of kleptocracy in the 20th century. During Mobutu's rule, the Congo, one of the most resource-rich countries on earth, became one of the poorest. The copper revenues, the cobalt profits, the diamond exports, the wealth flowed outward to foreign corporations and to Mobutu's personal accounts in Swiss banks, not to Congolese schools, hospitals, and roads. This is what Lumumba had tried to prevent. This is precisely what he had warned against. And this is what his elimination made possible. The political instability set in motion by Lumumba's assassination and Mobutu's dictatorship generated conflicts that continue into the present day. After Mobutu was finally overthrown in 1997, the Congo entered a period of devastating warfare. The Second Congo War, which ran from 1998 to 2003, is estimated to have killed between 3 and 5 million people, making it the deadliest conflict on earth since World War II. Fighting over the Eastern Congo's mineral wealth, including coltan, used in virtually every smartphone on the planet, continues in various forms to this day. The minerals that Lumumba wanted to use to build his country have instead become the fuel for endless conflict, exploited by local warlords, neighboring states, and multinational corporations. Every time you use a device powered by cobalt from the Congo, you are holding in your hands a piece of a story that began with a man who was killed for daring to imagine that his people deserved the wealth beneath their own feet. In death, Patrice Lumumba became something he never quite became in life, an ambiguous symbol. Across Africa and the African diaspora, his name became synonymous with the promise of true independence and with the betrayal of that promise by colonial and neo-colonial forces. He studied in universities from Dakar to Chicago. His speeches are read and quoted. His story has been told in films, most notably in the 2000 film Lumumba by Asian director Raoul Peck, in plays, in novels, in poems. Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, now the People's Friendship University of Russia, was renamed in his honor in 1961 as a direct political statement. Streets, schools, and public squares across Africa bear his name. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in 1961 that was widely understood as a condemnation of the circumstances of his death, though carefully worded to avoid direct accusation. In 2001, the Belgian Parliamentary Commission concluded that Belgium bore moral and political responsibility for Lumumba's death. Belgian Foreign Minister Louis Michel expressed regret. Belgium returned the tooth in 2022. A square in Brussels was renamed in Lumumba's honor. In the United States, declassified documents have illuminated the extent of CIA involvement and high-level political decision-making around Lumumba's removal, but there has been no formal government acknowledgement, no apology, and no reckoning with the role American Cold War policy played in the destruction of Congolese democratic governance. For many historians and for many Congolese people, the acknowledgements that have come are too little, too late, and too incomplete. Justice, in any meaningful sense, has not been done. But perhaps the most important question is not what was done to Lumumba. It is what was prevented and whether it can still be achieved. African resource sovereignty, true economic independence, Pan-African political cooperation, the right of African peoples to control their own destinies, their own wealth, their own futures. These ideas did not die with Lumumba. They went underground. They resurfaced in Thomas Sankara's Burkina Faso in the 1980s, in the African Union's aspirations, in contemporary debates about renegotiating mining contracts, in young African economists challenging the terms of international debt. The vision survives. The struggle continues. The question Lumumba asked, who does Africa's wealth belong to, has not yet been fully answered. What does the story of Patrice Lumumba teach us? It teaches us that ideas are dangerous, that the idea of dignity, the simple radical idea that a people deserve to govern themselves and benefit from their own labor, can terrify governments and mobilize armies. It teaches us that independence is not a single moment. It is a process, long, difficult, and incomplete. The raising of a flag does not end colonialism. The signing of a constitution does not guarantee sovereignty. True independence requires the redistribution of economic power, the right to control one's own resources, the freedom to make decisions without foreign interference. Lumumba understood this. His enemies understood it too. That is why they moved so quickly, so violently to remove him. It teaches us about the Cold War's particular cruelty, how a global ideological struggle between two distant powers was allowed to destroy the political futures of nations that had barely emerged from colonialism. Millions of people paid the price of a binary world in which they had no voice. It teaches us about complicity, that crimes of this magnitude require not just perpetrators but enablers, politicians who look away, corporations that benefit, historians who omit, textbooks that simplify. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us about memory. The attempt to destroy Lumumba, to dissolve his body in acid, to erase his physical existence was an attempt to destroy memory itself. It failed because memory, like that Congo River, keeps moving. You cannot dam it forever. Patrice Lumumba was 35 years old when he died. He served as prime minister for less than 3 months before being stripped of effective power. He governed nothing in the end except the idea of what the Congo could be. And yet 60 years later, his name is still spoken. His portrait is still raised. His words are still read. That is power. That is legacy. That is what they could not kill. Thank you for watching Africa Hidden History. If this documentary moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you think, please take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. The story of Africa is long, complex, and extraordinary. There are hundreds of chapters that the world has never been told. That is why this channel exists. In our next episode, we will explore another chapter of Africa's hidden history, the story of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso who, like Lumumba, dared to imagine true African sovereignty and paid for that vision with his life. He called himself Africa's Che Guevara. His enemies called him dangerous. History calls him unforgettable. Don't miss it. Until next time, know your history, know your power, know yourself.